An artist by the name of Sally Mann, and her images, even though extremely intimate and personal, have caused a lot of controversy in the realm of child pornography. She is an artist, explains this series, Immediate Family, as quoted as saying, "It's not that I was particularly interested in kids, they were just there and I had my camera, so I photographed them." And what a lot of people don't know is that her upbringing was very similar to the way that she brought up her own kids, as is usual practice. Parents tend to bring up their kids the way they were brought up with certain changes. And she was allowed to run wild. She was the youngest of a number of kids. They had like 12 dogs. She was surrounded by this pack of wild animals while she was growing up, and she just ran wild for the first like 8 years of her life. And so when she had her own children, they ran wild similarly. They were running around naked, playing in the yard, and it was not a big deal to her. And her, as a photographer, took advantage of that. But for a lot of people without that context, you see images like this, and that one on the right sort of looks like a child that's been beaten or scarred, whipped or something like that, even though that's just grass that's being stuck to the wet body. Or over here, damaged child, black and white, which without context, again, the title just sort of alludes to child abuse in some way, shape, or form. But the fact is, on the one on the left here, bee sting on the eye. That was all that happened. But again, without context, people get upset. Same thing there on the right. In that case, she also talks about her photographs as being realistic in that she was photographing the kids that her kids were doing. Many of them are posed, i.e. the one there on the right, but also encompassing some ideas of the fantastic or the fantasy to some element or another. So if you go to the next one for me. Her son, Emmett, also a part of a number of her photos. There on the left, bloody nose, and another bloody nose there on the right. But again, without context, how do we know what happens? We know the rambunctiousness of little boys and maybe the fights they get into and so forth and so on. But all you see is this sort of shocked kid who is drenched in his own blood. But the composition, the way that it has been cut off, we don't see his eyes, that negates a lot of our interpretation because we don't know if it's sort of shock and awe of what just happened to me, is he upset, or is it something that he's comfortable with and laughing at. It almost looks like she was taking a photograph or hit the button by accident as she was coming up. There on the right, again, was he and this little kid, did he and this little kid get into a fight, or is Emmett prone to bloody noses just out of nowhere? She doesn't necessarily explain these things, but she photographs these, what are generally intimate moments, things that most parents wouldn't photograph. And so when they were presented to audiences in museums and galleries, there was this pushback, as though she were presenting things that were part of the personal domain and not part of the public domain. Especially in the intimate poses like in the next one. Jessie Mann and the Big Burger, 1990. But her kids at, 10, 11 years old, boys, girls, again running around naked. They lived out in Virginia. They had a camp out there. The kids just ran wild, played in the river, did whatever they wanted to do. But then something a little bit more sinister happens over here on the left with candy cigarettes. I don't know about today, but I know I grew up when candy cigarettes were available and you could go to the gag store and buy the fake cigarettes, and when you blew on them, powder would come out the end and you could pretend like you were a cool kid smoking or whatever when they'd sell them to you like 8 years old because it came from a gag shop. But all that happened here was that, again, she's playing with a candy cigarette, and you can see Emmett there in the background, blurred a little bit, playing on stilts, the other sister watching. And all she did was ask her daughter to turn around, and she naturally just turned around with this pose of almost somebody who'd been smoking for 10 years and had that behind her. But it again leads into the question of the context of the image. Is the child actually smoking? Who's taking responsibility for it? What ideas do we allow our children to take part in by pretending to do something as dangerous as smoking? I'm a smoker, I don't care. But then you've also got, Jessie Mann and the Big Burger. And even when company would come over, the kids still running around naked, and you see the parents kissing them on the heads. And so there is still this intimacy to them that makes people uncomfortable. Think about somebody photographing your children in a state of intimate play. Are we comfortable with people photographing our kids, especially if we don't know them, or even if we do want somebody photographing our kids? In most cases, no. In this society, it is not necessarily a good thing. So she continued this body of work, and this being one of the more controversial images, one of the staged images, white squash, black and white photograph, 1988, her youngest daughter. And one of the biggest problems that emerged from this immediate family series was the notion that this was child pornography. And for her, of course, it was not. It was an artistic experiment. It was documentation of her children's childhood. But there was a raid on a child pornographer's house, and they found her images on his computer. And so then the context changes based on the person who has chosen to use them for those purposes. But that gets into issues of who's right, who's wrong, what authority does the artist sacrifice when they put their work out for public view. There's nothing you can do about it in the digital age. When you put an image or an image ends up on the internet, anybody can download it and use it for whatever purposes they want, regardless of the artist's intentions. Her shows have been shut down due to death threats as well as pickets and riots. I believe the last one that was shut down, it was only a few years ago. In response to it, Elton John bought the entire collection from the museum and ended up displaying it on his own for people to see, as opposed to having to go through the museums or galleries that were obviously intimidating. It's not to say that they didn't want to show the work, but the physical safety of their employees and of that place being burned down and so forth and so on were immediate concerns. And even the previous two artists, museums had to respond in similar ways by not having shows because of physical threats made against employees, the artists, as well as the spaces themselves. And lastly, a little bit of political commentary. This image, and I actually just found this one last night, the artist, street artist by the name of Bluth, B-L-U, and he was asked to paint a mural on the side of Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art. That's all he was asked to do. They did not give him any boundaries in which he could not cross in terms of painting this. Well, the curator ended up going out of town for a month or something like that, and when he came back, he found a mural of coffins covered with American money instead of American flags, referencing dead American soldiers from the various wars that we've been involved in for the last many years. But talking about how these men and women in service have died for business interests as opposed to dying for ideas of freedom and democracy and so forth and so on. You go to the next one for me. 24 hours after the mural's completion, it was whitewashed. The guy got back and said, "We're painting over this." And they had received no threats, no complaints whatsoever. It was just the decision of the museum's curator. He said that he did not want to offend the Veterans Affairs office or another consulate or something of that nature that were in direct relationship to this museum across the street or down the block or something like that. So it was immediately painted over, only 24 hours, so there are very few photographs of this image actually in existence. I mean, you're basically seeing them. And he was invited to paint another mural, but he has since declined as far as I know. This took place last year. He has since declined, basically on his own morals, not wanting to go back and have to deal with the politics of presenting another image that may be censored, again, for whatever reasons that may be. But the next one? That's it, though. But that hopefully gives you a broad perspective of what artists are dealing with. Art today has sort of evolved into cultural criticism more than making pretty pictures or pretty images, obviously. And this is the way that a lot of artists choose to do that. Street art is one of the main components of that sort of criticism, in that, number one, street art is usually considered vandalism, destruction of public property, or the altering of public property in some way, shape, or form. And another artist who I didn't include, his name is Banksy. Maybe some of you have heard of him. Those in my class should have. But he puts work up in various places around the world, and I cannot remember, or the piece is actually a stencil of a rat falling through the air with a parachute on. It was valued at $100,000. The state maintenance people came through and painted over it because they thought it was just regular graffiti. Inadvertent censorship.
Were they fined?
They were not fined or fired. They did not know anything about it, so the state sanitation, or the government sanitation department has since made it a goal of theirs to educate their repainting department onto what is acceptable to paint over and not to paint over. And even one of Banksy's works that was on private property, it was painted over because, of course, the owner, it's his property. Banksy did it without his permission. He painted over it, and he was fined something like $20,000 for destruction of public art for painting over his own house. So that gives you an idea of what artists in contemporary society are dealing with, how they're dealing with it, and the challenges that they face. I hope you have gotten something out of these few images and presentations, and I thank you for your time.